So I wanted to give a brief introduction of Sigmund Freud related to his psychoanalytic theory. And it's helpful to think about Freud in terms of three different stages of thought. First stage from 1895 to around 1900, 1900 to about 1920, and then 1920 and on. And each of these stages really are related to the publishing of various books or articles. The first article being studies on hysteria. The next being interpretation of dreams. Which is a large book where Freud analyzes 700 of his own dreams. And then in 1923, when he publishes The Ego and the Id, and the id. And then he also further delineates the idea of the superego, which had been present for some time. So the first stage there, studies on hysteria, he publishes, and it's externally focused. Now, Freud had worked with his friend Joseph Bauer and had studied under Charcot, and they were using hypnosis, which Freud abandons and asks patients to just lie down and start to talk about whatever comes to mind. And he notices that eventually people get to memories, which he called, which he eventually uses the word repressed, that they were repressing, and was hoping that they could bring these memories forward, and then a tension would be released. And when that tension was released, then the psychic energy that they were holding back would allow a catharsis. So this is the cathartic method to happen, and then that would result in a cure of their conversion disorder or what have you, and of their hysteria. Now, Freud thought that at this stage, whenever he was defining it, that every person with hysteria had real trauma in their life that was causing the hysteria. And when he proposed this in his studies on hysteria, the medical or community of Vienna felt like this was not correct, that this couldn't be correct, and that he was really accusing many people of high means. And you may say, well, maybe some of those people of high means were committing sexual acts against their daughters or family members, but it seemed difficult to believe that all of them were. And so Freud then felt like he had to go back and re-examine his theory. And so then he came out with the interpretation of dreams. And so he moves internally. And really then, this is a fundamental shift. So up here he's attempting to ab-react, was the word used, and release tension and open up these repressed memories from external traumas. Now he's asking people to move internally, comes up with the ideas of infantile sexuality, which were not, people really were scandalized by the idea that infants could have ideas of sex or thoughts about sexual desires, and develops the ideas of libido, and aggression as being the driving forces from various biological zones, oral, anal, genital, and so forth, that this driving force moved throughout the body and would result in causing people to interact in their lives. And that this happened on an unconscious level, a pre-conscious level, or a conscious level, and that each of these different levels were separated by what was originally called the censor, but wouldn't allow thoughts to move from one area to the other. So the thoughts would get blocked, and they could not move into the next phase. They could move from one phase to the next phase and be expressed through free association, by just talking and following the rule. The rule was to say anything that came to mind without holding anything back. Or they came and one's real drives, wishes, desires, and wants were manifested in one's dreams. And dreams were called by Freud the royal road to the unconscious. And so he shifts from trying to release tension and abreact to trying to kind of understand what someone wants. And then in the third phase, so the middle phase, this is kind of the affect trauma phase. This is called the topographical, because he's now given a topographical phase of the mind, and then this is called the structural, the third phase. So in the structural model, he starts to understand that there's different processes at play that can be unconscious, preconscious, or conscious, and they seem to be relating to one another in various ways. And he calls it the ego, which is seems to be taking the drives, which he says live in this id, and these drives are attempting to influence the ego, and then the ego's goal is to and the id is unconscious. And the ego is both conscious and unconscious. And the ego attempts to take these wishes, desires, wants, and help them relate to external reality. So he's now made a swing back towards the external, which he talked about in the first phase, as well as the newer entity that he bores out and plays into is called the super ego, which is another unconscious entity that is the accumulation and amalgamation of one's parental prohibitions, desires, as well as societal prohibitions, desires, expectations. Often thought of as a punitive entity, later structural drive thinkers, because the drives are still present here, so the drives still exist here. So structural drive model. Later, superego starts to have positive and negative connotations, but generally is thought of as a punishing entity to keep the ego in line, to help the ego understand how to keep the drives and the id in line as it navigates the reality of the external and forces that can also be conscious and unconscious. And you might say, how can they be unconscious? Because you might encounter something in the external world that's influencing you in a way that one is not even aware of. And so these are the three kind of phases of Freud's thought. Now, it's a very basic phase. Freud was a prodigious writer, and I've only chosen three of his articles to define him, which is not fair to him because he wrote so much. But that's kind of an intro.